What happens after 30 days of no caffeine inside your body, but mainly inside your brain? What can you expect to feel? And more importantly, what is a strategy that you can follow? Maybe you don't want to cut out caffeine entirely, but you want to understand how it works so that you can throttle your usage to get the best effect out of it. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to talk about what the most interesting aspect of caffeine is. Okay, and that is how it works first and foremost. We're going to talk about dopamine. Now, dopamine is the reward system within our body. When dopamine binds to a dopamine receptor, we get a big sense of reward. We actually get an energy burst from that as well. But that's not the real reason caffeine gives us energy. I want you to imagine a situation where someone says something very nice to you. They give you a compliment and you feel really good. You almost get an energy boost, right? Well, because that dopamine, that feel good, can actually give you energy as well. But what's happening with caffeine is binding to what is called an adenosine receptor. Adenosine receptors receive something called adenosine. When adenosine hits that receptor, it makes us tired. And eventually, throughout the course of the day, adenosine builds up and eventually overloads our brain to the point where we just get tired and we fall asleep. Caffeine blocks that receptor. So adenosine just builds and builds and builds and builds. And then eventually the caffeine wears off and the adenosine hits the receptor all at once and we get pretty tired. What does this have to do with dopamine? Well, we're going to talk about that. And the reason that I start with dopamine is because it's very, very important. So when we have caffeine, we get a dopamine hit. We feel really good when we have caffeine. Now, if you look at a study that was published in Translational Psychiatry, it's kind of interesting because they don't particularly know if caffeine itself is triggering a dopamine response or if it's the simple act of interfering with the adenosine receptor. In other words, we don't know what's causing the dopamine hit, but it's happening. But one thing that we have seen in this literature is that the availability of the D2 and D3 dopamine receptors, so basically what catches dopamine, we end up with more of them. So we have more nets to catch dopamine. What that means is that caffeine makes us more sensitive to stimulus. So in other words, caffeine makes it so that the things that make us feel good feel extra good, which can make it all the more addicting. And one of the things that we deal with caffeine is the ritual, right? We enjoy our cup of coffee. We enjoy that whole process. But the fact that we have now increased the availability of the dopamine receptors means that that ritual feels even better, okay? So one of the things that you will notice first, because it's very, very quick to fix, is you'll start noticing you have more control over cravings, you have more control over your mood, you have more control over even your need for caffeine, and that happens within a couple of days. So although I rambled off a bunch of science here first, this is sort of the pinnacle of everything that cascades down. If you start talking to people that cut out caffeine, they'll tell you within the first 4 or 5 days, they notice that they are able to control their hunger more, which is wild because caffeine itself is somewhat of an appetite suppressant. But we're almost artificially suppressing our appetite with caffeine, whereas when the caffeine is weaned off, we have more innate control over our appetite. We can actually look at foods and resist the urge. Why is that? Because we haven't been starting the day with a cascade of fireworks in our brain that is dopamine. Every time we hit ourselves with dopamine, we become desensitized and we need more and more and more and more. And those dopamine receptors don't know the difference between caffeine or sex or food. All they know is they want that hit. And when we become desensitized across the board. Now, the next thing that you'll notice within like 5 to 7 days is less general fatigue throughout the day. And you're probably thinking, well, caffeine is supposed to keep me awake, so caffeine is going to prevent my fatigue. Well, no, you actually get fatigued even on the days you have caffeine and you're not even realizing it. It's happening at what I would call a micro level. So there was a study that was published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence that looked at sort of withdrawal and micro withdrawal, where how quickly you start to feel withdrawal symptoms. Remember that caffeine is blocking the adenosine receptor. So when the caffeine wears off, you start getting tired. Well, they noticed that less than 16 hours in, withdrawal symptoms are starting. affecting mood, affecting hunger, affecting your fatigue, all of this stuff. And that's at a very measurable level. So what this is suggesting is that yes, when you come down from caffeine or when you come off of caffeine for a few days, you absolutely have withdrawal symptoms. But these withdrawal symptoms are potentially happening within hours of having caffeine. So you're having these micro fatigues that are getting masked by more caffeine. So in essence, you're almost borrowing from later in the day and consolidating it in the morning. There's no free rides. There's no free energy. The energy you have in the morning is legitimately being borrowed from later in the day. So your productivity will probably increase. Now, a suggestion that I have for people is to go every other day with caffeine. It's something I talked about with Chris Williamson, who's kind of an expert in this as well, his own experience. If you go every other day without caffeine, you allow yourself the ability to remain sensitive to it so you can still get the effectiveness that you want. Within about 7 to 10 days, you'll start to notice improvements in sleep. Some people notice it even sooner, and personally it took a little while for me. And what I think happens here, a little bit of my theory, is when we have caffeine, we get a cortisol spike. And our circadian biology likes to kind of hold on to rhythmic nature of these cortisol spikes. So we get up in the morning, we have caffeine, and we have this cortisol spike, right? Now, we put ourselves into what is called the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight with a little bit of caffeine and cortisol. Now, when the caffeine is cut out of the equation, the body kind of hangs on to that pattern for a while. So you almost hang on, even though you're like having withdrawal symptoms, you hang on to that fight or flight. And that happens especially in the morning. But your body starts wanting to wake up because it anticipates this cortisol spike. So it's like you're waking up at 5:30 a.m. no matter what, because that's what you've been doing and that's when you've been having coffee. It takes about 7 to 10 days for that to sort of wear off. Now, after that, you do notice an improvement in sleep. There was a study published in Sleep Medicine Reviews that found that dependence develops at a surprisingly low dose. So you can develop dependence on caffeine at like 30, 40 milligrams per day. And even that amount, still in dose-dependent fashion, will affect your sleep. So the point is with this is that even if you wean off of caffeine and you lower the amount, yes, you can improve your sleep a little bit, but the best thing to do is to probably just go cold turkey and then try to go back to this every other day type fashion. One of the things that I like to do in place of coffee in the morning is on the days that I don't have caffeine, I usually have like apple cider vinegar, I have some salt, usually I'll have some electrolytes. What I find is that that perks me up pretty well. Now, there's sort of the old, I almost call it mythical thing about having salt in the morning and how it relieves your adrenal glands and it can help with adrenal fatigue. You know, I kind of fell victim to that thought process for a while, but the more that I've learned about science and how this all works, you know, adrenal fatigue is not necessarily this real thing. However, adrenal insufficiency is, and sodium can help you out with that whole process. That being said, I feel like electrolytes just kind of wake me up in the morning. So it's a good void. It's a good void fill, like a stopgap instead of caffeine. I popped a link down below for the ones that I use. They're called LMNT. That link is also going to get you a free variety pack if you want to try it out. So you get a free variety pack with whatever purchase you do. I just recommend you try it instead of coffee. So go coffee, electrolytes, coffee, electrolytes. Or if you don't want to get electrolytes, try just salt water. Salt water is fine too. It's totally cool. You don't have to spend money on this. I just like them because they taste good and they kind of perk me up and makes it a little bit more fun. So anyway, that link is down below, drinklmnt.com/Thomas, drinkelement.com/Thomas, down below. The next thing that you'll notice after maybe 10 to 14 days is you'll notice less headaches. Now, before you turn off this video because you're someone that doesn't suffer with headaches, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt that tightness in your head? Not quite a headache, but sort of, I don't know, not even airy. It's just like tight, where you really want someone to just almost massage your head, right? Well, that's not quite a headache, but that still is almost borderline symptomatic with the restriction in blood flow that we see in people that consume caffeine. Now, check this out. There's a study published in Human Brain Mapping that took a look at low caffeine consumption, so people that had 45 milligrams per day, people that had moderate, like 400-ish milligrams per day, and people that had a lot, like 950 milligrams per day. And then what they did is they divided them into two groups. Okay, they had 3 weeks of decaf coffee or 3 weeks of regular. Okay, they didn't know which one they were getting. So what they did with these 3 different groups of various caffeine consumption is they put them under MRI scan under 4 separate occasions. So either 250 milligrams of caffeine or a placebo group. What they found is that whenever caffeine was in the equation, there was a decrease in cerebral blood flow. So there was vasoconstriction. We know caffeine is a vasoconstrictor. It means that it restricts blood vessels. What happened is they had a 27% reduction in blood flow to the brain, which kind of sounds bad, right? That's not exactly good when it comes down to a headache anyway. But the problem wasn't the restriction. The problem was anytime someone abstained from caffeine or came off of it or even reduced it, there was a counterbalance effect where there was an increase in cerebral blood flow. It is speculated that the increase in cerebral blood flow is what is triggering the headache. It's an adaptation to trying to adapt to a massive amount of blood flow coming into the brain. This adds up when you look at a study that was published in Neurology. That was a larger scale study that looked at 507 control people and 180 people that were chronic daily headache sufferers. They found that chronic daily headaches were significantly more common in people that didn't just recently have caffeine, but had previously had caffeine. Okay, so what that's telling us is it's A, either a withdrawal thing, or B, something that's changed neurochemically in people that had consumed more caffeine. So the higher the caffeine intake previously, the higher the instance of chronic daily headaches. So what I'm saying with this is that when you first do cut out caffeine, you can expect to have headaches. That is what is potentially causing the withdrawal headache. It's not necessarily the dopamine insufficiency. It might literally just be pathological. It might be more blood and the brain just can't deal with it. That will go away once these constant micro fluctuations occur. So essentially every time you have caffeine and every time it comes out of your system, even at a micro level and a big level, you're having these changes in cerebral blood flow. That might not be the best thing for us. So with this, we can talk about caffeine and mental performance because this is a very, very important one, a very big one. People think they have caffeine and it improves their mental performance, their cognitive function. And in a certain way it does, okay? It increases the ability to not necessarily critically think, but it can increase alertness. Now, if you look at a study published in Psychopharmacology, we see pretty clear what's going on here. So what they did is they had subjects go 3 weeks with decaf or 3 weeks with regular in a blind fashion. They didn't know what they were getting. They found that even in a short-term effect, withdrawal effects that could happen overnight or even shorter had an impact on cognitive function. It impaired cognitive function, but the provision of caffeine would actually prevent that impairment. So what that means is whenever we go off and on caffeine, we have these ups and downs in cognitive performance, okay? And then when caffeine is implemented back in, we're back there again, we're back up. We can have that cognitive performance and that cognitive function that we want. But every time the caffeine wears off, we have an impairment of it. So when you first come off of caffeine, you will probably notice that you don't feel as sharp. But then as time goes on, after 5 days, 6 days, and probably continuing to get better and better for like 20 to 30 days, you're probably not gonna reach your peak control of your cognitive function for like 20 or 30 days after caffeine. So does caffeine impair cognitive function? No, caffeine actually increases cognitive function, but caffeine doesn't last forever. So that is exactly why I'm a fan of sparing caffeine for when it is necessary. Use caffeine as a tool. If you use it as a tool to get through life, you're going the wrong direction. Caffeine is a powerful ergogenic aid, a powerful cognitive aid, and we need to preserve its integrity for that. I use caffeine on my filming days so that I get the effect, but you bet your bottom dollar by the end of the day, I am thrashed. Now, one of the last things you'll start to notice is you're probably more hydrated. Here's what's interesting. Caffeine is interesting because if you have concentrated amounts of caffeine, it has a diuretic effect. If you have highly diluted caffeine, like a bunch of green tea or something like that, it doesn't have as much of a diuretic effect. Well, it has the same diuretic effect, milligram per milligram, but what happens is it's pretty hard to offset the fluid. Like if you have a big cup of green tea, it's going to have a diuretic effect, but not enough to counter the fluid you got in from the tea, right? What it is going to do, however, it is going to send you to the bathroom more. Now, you might be thinking that means it has a diuretic effect. No, it just means the likelihood of that fluid going through you faster is much higher. So as long as you're drinking enough water in conjunction with caffeine, it's never going to be an issue. But you don't start noticing the effects of rehydration for weeks. It's crazy because you can dehydrate and rehydrate yourself over a couple of days, But if you really are chronically dehydrated, it might take a couple weeks to get yourself really balanced and remineralized again. Another reason why I'm a fan of electrolytes, but that's not really the point of this video. I think that we lose our minerals through dehydration, and it takes a lot of eating specific foods and micronutrients to rebalance where we need to be. So my encouragement to you is not to say, hey, just cut out caffeine. I think if you want to, you gain an element of mastery and control, and I think a wise thing would be taking 15 or 30 days off every year just to regain control. But realistically, it's more about taking days off or taking weekends off, letting yourself be tired and reset those dopamine receptor availability a little bit so that you get more out of it. I'll see you tomorrow.